Relative execution order, user code and extension code in JUnit. Here you can see the relative execution order of the user code and extension code. This diagram illustrates the relative order of user supplied code. And the extension code. User supplied test and the lifecycle method are shown in orange, with callback code implemented by extensions shown in blue. The gray box denotes the execution of a single test method and will be repeated for every test method in the test class. Here the step 1, the interface or annotation. The interface org.junit.jupyter.api.extension.before all callback. Extension code executed before all tests of the container are executed. To the annotation org.junit.jupyter.api.before all user code executed before all tests of the container are executed. Interface 3, the interface org.junit.jupyter.api.extension.lifecycle method execution exception handler handler before all method execution exception. Extension for handling exception thrown from at before all methods. For interface org.junit.jupyter.api.extension.before each callback. Extension code executed before each test is executed. File the annotation org.junit.jupyter.api.before each user code executed before each test is executed. The 6, the interface org.junit.jupyter.api.extension.lifecycle method execution exception handler handler before each method execution exception. Extension code for handling exception thrown from the before each methods. 7, interface org.junit.jupyter.api.extension.before test execution callback. Extension code executed immediately before a test is executed. 8, annotation org.junit.jupyter.api.test user code of the actual test method. 9, interface org.junit.jupyter.api.extension.test execution exception handler. Extension code for handling exception thrown during a test. 10, interface org.junit.jupyter.api.extension.after test execution callback. Extension code executed immediately after a test execution and its corresponding exception handlers. 11, annotation org.junit.jupyter.api.after each user code executed after each test is executed. 12 interface org.junit.jupyter.api.extension.lifecycle method execution exception handler handle after each method execution exception. Extension code for handling exception thrown from after each methods. 13 interface org.junit.jupyter.api.extension after each callback. Extension code executed after each test is executed. 13 14 annotation org.junit.jupyter.api.after all. User code executed after all tests of the container are executed. 15 interface org.junit.jupyter.api.extension.lifecycle method execution exception handler handle after all method execution exception. Extension code for handling exception thrown from the after all methods. Interface org.junit.jupyter.api.extension.after all callback. Extension code executed after all tests of the container are executed. In the simplest case, only the actual test method will be executed. Step 8. All other steps are optional depending on the presence of user code or extension support for corresponding lifecycle callbacks. For further details on the various lifecycle callbacks, please consult the respective Java doc for each annotation and extension. Here the interface before all callback in package org.junit.jupyter.api.extension in module org.junit.jupyter.api. This before all callback defines and the API extension that wish to provide additional behavior to test containers once before all tests in the container have been executed. The annotation interface before all in package org.junit.jupyter.api in module org.junit.jupyter.api. At before all is used to signal that annotated method should be executed before all tests in the current test class. The here the default void handle before all method execution exception extension context throwable in the interface lifecycle method execution exception handler. Handle the supplied throwable that was thrown during the execution of at before lifecycle method. Interface before each callback. Before each callback defines the API for extensions that wish to provide additional behavior to tests before an individual test and any user-defined setup method, for example before each methods for that the test have been executed. Annotation interface before each. At before each is used to signal that the annotated method should be executed before each at test, at repeated test, at parameterized test, at test factory, and at test template method in the current test class. Default void handle before each method execution exception, extension context throwable in interface lifecycle method execution exception handler. The handle the supply throwable that was thrown during the execution of before each lifecycle method. Interface before test execution callback. Before test execution callbacks defines the API for extension that wish to provide additional behavior to the test immediately before an individual test is executed. But after any user-defined setup method, for example, at before each methods have been executed for that test. Annotation interface test. At test is used to signal that annotated method is a test method. Interface test execution exception handler. The test execution exception handler defines the API for extensions that wish to handle exceptions thrown during the test execution. Interface after test execution callback. After test execution callbacks define the API for extensions that wish to provide additional behavior to test immediately after an individual test has been executed before any user-defined tear down methods. For example, after each methods have been executed for that test. Annotation interface after each. After each is used to signal that the annotated method should be executed after each at test, at repeated test, at parameterized test, at test factory, and at test template method in the current test class. Handle after each method execution exception. The default void handle after each method execution exception, extension context throwable in interface lifecycle method execution exception handler. handle the supply throwable that was thrown during the execution of after each lifecycle method. Interface after each callback. After each callback, define the API for extensions that want to provide that wish to provide additional behavior to test after an individual test, and any user-defined tear down methods. For example, at after each method that the test have been executed. The annotation interface after all. At after all methods must have a void return. The after all is used to signal that the annotated method should be executed after all tests in the current test class. The default void handle after all method execution exception, extension context throwable in interface lifecycle method execution exception handle the supply throwable that was thrown during the execution of at after all lifecycle method. Interface after all callback. After all callback, define the API for extensions that wish to provide additional behavior to test containers once after all tests container have been executed. Here the extension codes are here, the before all callback, before and these exceptions, and before each callback, before test execution callback, after test execution callback, after each callback, after all callback, and these lifecycle methods. And the user codes are at before all, at before each, at test, at after each, at after all. Here the steps, the order is before all callback, then at before all to the lifecycle method execution exception handler at hash handle before all method execution exception, then before each callback, then at before each, then lifecycle method execution exception handler at hash handler before each method execution exception, then before test execution callback, then at test, then test execution exception handler, then after test execution callback, then at after each, then lifecycle method execution exception handler hash handle after each method execution exception, then at after each callback, then at after all, then lifecycle method execution exception handler hash handle after all method execution exception, then after all callback. Now this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for watching it.